Okay.
Okay, perfect. So do you want me to just jump right in?
You can jump right in.
Okay, great. So, hello, my name is Elizabeth Vossler, and I am a speech language pathologist in Northern Virginia in Herndon. I'm the director of Growing Kids Therapy Center, and I also am the executive director of a nonprofit organization called IASC, the International Association for Spelling as Communication, and I'll talk about both organizations a little bit later. And just so I know you guys a little bit, can you use the hand raise feature to indicate if you are a parent of a child or adult who has Down syndrome? Okay.
Could also do the chat room.
Mhm. I saw
So-
2 hands raised and I see the chat. Okay, great. And do any of you perhaps are the parent of a child or adult with autism? I see 2 for Down syndrome. Okay, I see a couple more in there too. All right, great. Okay, awesome. Well, it's good to know. And if you're something else besides a parent, let me know. If you're here as a therapist, a friend, a sibling, whatever that might be. It just helps me know my audience a little bit better. And you can type that into the chat. Okay, so with Down syndrome. Okay, great. So it looks like mostly parents here. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to pop into this, and I also want to introduce my 2 special guests who are co-presenting with me, and that is Sid Ghosh and Vaish Sarti. And so Sid and Vaish, can you just pop on your camera for a second and say hello?
Hi, it's great being here. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, everyone. I'm Vaish, this is Sid.
So thank you for joining us. Vaish and Sid are joining us from Portland, Oregon, where I have known them now for a good, probably 4 years, right, Vaish?
Oh, almost 5 years, Elizabeth. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's been quite a while, and Sid and I worked together when he was about what, 7?
7 or 8 years old. Yeah.
Yeah, and we actually even later worked together in a treehouse. It's one of my favorite pictures of Sid and I working together in a treehouse with, I think, his little sister sprawled across my lap as well. So it's great to have them here. So these are my 2 experts here joining us in the conversation, and they're going to pop in and out a couple times during the presentation. So thanks for joining in, Vaish and Sid.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen so that you're able, whoopsie, maybe, so that you'll be able to see my, yes. That's what I'm going to present over here. Oh, nope, not that. Sorry, this is a little bit different than I'm used to with, I've zoomed my face off, so I just want to make sure I've got the right, okay, that looks right. Do you guys see my slides? Oops, the only thing is that now I've lost you guys, so I can only, Okay, do you guys see my slides? I see a little window, but then I'm not sure if that's what you see.
We can see it. It's just a little bit cut off. It's like we can see 2/3 of the slide, I think.
Oh, that's weird. Okay. Is that better? I just made my screen big. Oops, can you guys see it? Do you see my my slides?
Evie, it looks like it's still cut off. I don't know if you can command minus to try to zoom out a little bit.
Let me see if I can. How's that? Any better?
No.
Maybe I.
Can you advance to the next
Can you
slide?
advance
just
to the
see what
next
it
slide
looks
just
like?
to see what it looks like?
Yeah. Well, that one's up at the top only. Any better?
I mean, we can see everything on that slide, I think. But it's still only showing
I
part of
don't
it.
know. That's weird because let me see if I'm sharing it in some weird way. Sorry, guys. I'm just not used to this particular application window. What's happening there? Do you see my slides, Julie? Or do you see like
it's
a
only
weird?
showing all of your whole screen. It's showing just whatever 2/3 of it or so.
Okay, so I'm gonna go back to stop share for a minute. And I'm gonna go to I think if I do it in your entire screen, then you see my my like desktop and stuff though.
Only for a split second until you get the slide up on your screen.
Okay, let me try that then. Sorry, hold. Okay. Is that any better?
I don't see you at all now.
Okay, yeah. Weird. Okay, we'll go with partial window. All right, and do you guys see a little bit of me and a little bit of my slides?
You're not up, but your slides are.
Okay, well, we'll pop back on. Okay, so sorry about that. All right, so let me get rolling in here. So I like to start off with a little exercise to say, imagine that we've come through and your mouth is taped up and your hands are tied up. How would you be able to communicate? And obviously, if your hands are tied up, you're not going to be able to communicate with me right now. But so we'll kind of give you a pass. Normally, when I do this exercise, I make people that they can't even they can't that they can't talk at all, so or use their hands. But I'm going to let you use your hands so that you can type into the chat how you would be able to communicate with me. Okay, so type into the chat. And sorry for all the like technical things, that makes me crazy. Okay, but you can't use your mouth. So if you're not using your mouth, and technically you're not able to use your hands, but you type into the chat for me, how would you be able to talk or communicate? So Kimberly said, eye gaze. That's great. Keep going. What else? Okay, I've got movement of the head, blinking with the special computer. Okay, good. Good. So you guys are honed into, there's not a lot you could do. Possibly your feet are free, so you could kick, you could, be rocking around in your chair. You can move your head back and forth, right? That's good, Holly. So those are a few ways you can communicate with your hands tied up and with your mouth taped up. So it's not a lot, right? Not a lot of options, but you could at least look like you're in distress. So now type into the chat for me what you could do if we untied your hands only. How could you communicate with me then? Okay, I've got ASL, nice. 2 ASLs. I've got gestures, great. What else? Hand gestures, yep. Cued speech, good. I see there's been a lot of therapy experience here. What else? Typing, yes. AAC device, yes. How about the magical thumbs that work so much faster in anyone below 30? Pointing, great, Holly. Kimberly, S2C, I've got a ringer. Okay, so the world's just to open up a little bit if you can use your hands. You can sign, you can type, you can use a device, you can use S2C. The other thing you can do is handwrite, right? Take your pencil and you can do some handwriting saying, help, this crazy lady tied me up. Okay, and now if I take your tape off your mouth, how can you communicate? Okay, speech, nice, Kimberly. Okay, great. So now just on sounds. You can make sounds. You can whistle, try to get some help going, things like that. So if I, now from what I'm seeing, can you guys see my slides sort of? And do you also see me in here? Julie, can you let me know? I'm gonna, for this angle,
Yep,
I
you're
can
good.
see,
Yep, you're good.
I can see you guys more, but I don't really see my slides. So I'm looking at my slides in another window. So if I look weirdly to the side, that's what's going on there. Okay, so all communication requires motor. Every form of communication that we use, whether that's hitting, kicking, pinching, pulling hair, the famous, point and grunt, leading you to something, picture exchange of various sorts requires motor. Signing, Morse code, drawing, handwriting, texting, typing, all of that is going to require motor. And if you use speech, it definitively uses motor. So there is, I would say, and I'm open to hearing otherwise, but shy of telepathic communication, all means of communication require motor, right? And the vast majority of people I know cannot communicate with telepathy. And even just, a little eye gaze, if you're a parent, you're really good with those eye gaze communications. But all of them still require purposeful motor. And so that's really what we have, what I've really shifted to over my years as a speech pathologist. So I introduced myself and said I'm a speech language pathologist. I have a practice in Northern Virginia in Herndon. I have been practicing for about 27 years, I think it is now. And for about 19 years of that, I was doing everything wrong. Because I was really looking at strictly cognition and a wee bit of behavior, but more on the motivation end. And I really did not hone in on the motor aspect of communication until about 6-7 years ago. My background is I started as a speech language pathologist at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Then I was a professor at for 12 years at George Washington University, where I taught master's and undergrad students in speech and language. And then I also taught master's degree students in the George Washington School of Education, Human Development. And, you know, I at one point really considered myself an expert on complex communications. And about, you know, like I said, 6, 7 years ago, realized I had really missed the mark. So let's talk a little primer on speech and language. And let me slightly shift my view. Okay, so when I'm talking, are you guys seeing the diagram? It is weird. It looks like it's just kind of on the side. I don't know what's going on with that. Is that any better? I kind of shifted my screen a bit to make it completely as full as I can be. Anyway, so when I'm talking, sounds are coming out of my mouth and they travel out into the air, and they are, in this case, they're going to come to your ear. They're going to go through the computer, through your speaker on your computer, and register in your ear, which is conveniently shaped like a little funnel, your pinup. So that sound is captured, it's funneled through the auditory system, through the auditory nerve, where it's going to register in Broca's area. So there's the guy, now I've switched my view, so I'm not, you see the guy right above his ear, there's a little gray area that is labeled as Wernicke's area. That is the area for language comprehension. So that's how you're understanding my speech sounds as meaningful, as sounds that are conveying meaning, and then those sounds are put together in words, those words are put in sentences, those sentences become paragraphs, and you understand what I'm saying, no matter how weird it might be, because my speech sounds are clear. And I can say any crazy thing and you're going to understand my words because of Wernicke's area. And you'll also be able to discriminate those speech sounds from non-meaningful, non-linguistic sounds like a whistle, like a dog bark, like the floor creaking or a door slamming, something like that. So connected by a bundle of fibers from Wernicke's area is a bundle of fibers called the arcuate fasciculus. And then there's an area called Broca's area. And Broca's area is the area for expressive language, which is essentially your thoughts and ideas in the form of words. So right now, you guys are all on mute. You're not communicating with me. And I trust that you are hearing my sounds, understanding my speech because of your Wernicke's area. Wernicke's is communicating with Broca's area. And in Broca's area, you're having thoughts and ideas like, oh, that's interesting, or I already knew that, or whatever you might be thinking, but you're having some thoughts and ideas about that. And that's sitting in Broca's area. Now, we talked about if you were taped and tied up, right? You still understood what I was saying in your fictitious hands taped behind your back or tied behind your back and tape over your mouth. And you had thoughts and ideas when all that was happening, but you weren't able to get them out in a effective and meaningful way with your hands restricted and with your mouth tied up. But it didn't mean that you weren't comprehending. It didn't mean that you didn't have thoughts and ideas in your head. You just had no way of communicating. Communication is defined as the exchange of information between two or more people. And I always say you might be talking to yourself, but you're not communicating, right? If you think you are communicating when you're talking to yourself, that's a whole nother kettle of fish to talk about, right? So in order to communicate, it's a sharing of ideas between at least two or more people. And in order to do that, we need motor. All means of communication requires motor. So I'm going to go to the next slide here, and we're going to take a look at motor. So actually, whoops, let me go back for a second to the other one. So you saw Broca's area, and then can you guys see if I use my pointer? Julie, can you give me a holler? Because now I can't look at multiple screens. I'm just not familiar with this platform. Do you see my pointer moving? The little red thing, Julie?
I do. I see your pointer.
Okay, great. So great, that at least helps me out. So this was Wernicke's, here's Broca's, arcuate fasciculus. Now, in order to get what I'm thinking out, I have to use the motor cortex, or what's called the motor strip, and I have to use the supplementary motor cortex, which sits about here in front of the motor strip. And then on the other side of the motor strip is the sensory strip. The sensory and motor strip are sandwiched right next to each other, and that's really important because sensory guides our motor, right? If you're driving, you need to see in order to effectively drive, or you need to see to be able to walk in your house, right? It's all dark, you might bump into furniture. There's ways of compensating, right? Like people who are blind become very good at echolocation and, may use a cane in order to feel their way around. But our senses guide our motor. If you're also in that dark room, you might reach out and feel for the light switch, right, to turn on. And, you feel along the wall and you're like, oh, there's the switch, and you can flip it on, right? So sensory guides the motor. The motor is here, and this little area in front of the motor cortex, or the motor strip, is the supplementary motor cortex, which lets you do things on demand. And that's important because that is our intentional motor. That's what we're really wanting to do, okay? And let me go to my next slide here. So this is a blown up visual of the motor strip. And this guy here, I love this guy. He's the homunculus. Homunculus is Greek for the little man. And he's a, whoopsie, I have a little bit of a sensitive mouse. He has really big toes, really big hands, really big lips, tongue, the bottom of his mouth, because this shows a visual representation of the motor strip. About 75%-ish of the motor strip is dedicated to movement of the articulators and the digits, right? The digits, the fingers and toes, and the articulators. Let's go back to our list of how we communicate. We use the digits, right? Typing, writing, handwriting, drawing, texting, signing, or the articulators, which are all the moving parts of speech that help us speak and also help us eat, right? So that's why there's so much power dedicated to there. Let me see, is everybody with me? Looking, okay, great. All right, I'm just gonna assume you guys are there listening and everything's going great. All right, so when you have a disconnect between that supplementary motor cortex and the motor strip, you have apraxia, right? And that's a disconnect between the brain and body. And many of you guys may be familiar with the term apraxia. You may also hear it called developmental apraxia, childhood apraxia of speech, dyspraxia. They're all essentially synonymous. And apraxia has to do with a breakdown between planning and execution, right? So the person then has difficulty sequencing and combining and coming up with words on demand in order to say them clearly and accurately, right? And this tends to break down with length and complexity. So in apraxia, there's a disconnect between brain and body. And we talk about that in terms of, or analogy for that is if I have talking to you on my cell phone, right? And what I'm saying is super clear, it's well thought out, it's, the articulation is great, what I'm saying makes sense, but there's a bad connection between my cell phone and your cell phone, and you're not receiving the message. And in apraxia, that's what's happening. The brain has a perfectly good plan, and the body is not receiving this message. This makes up the clientele that we work with at Growing Kids and IASK, right? People who have apraxia and call it the body-brain disconnect. So when that happens, there's difficulty producing speech. Now, some people will say, like I've sat in IEP meetings before, and people will say, well, that kid doesn't have any motor problems. They just walked in the door. And I'm not saying that they have no motor problems. In fact, a lot of times the gross motor is really pretty decent. But we're talking about that finely controlled motor. Some people say, well, he says some words, but those generally are words that are practiced over and over again. And the people we're talking about have difficulty if I ask a novel and new question, or a question that requires some complexity in the response. So that's generally what someone who's apraxic can look like a little bit. So going back to the slides, I have a couple of quotes here. Or we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So apraxia is a breakdown in the practice process. It means you have trouble coordinating movement and very difficult time initiating an action. And then inhibition is also hard too, right? Stopping it. Sometimes we've all had with kids, you know, they get on this thing and they're doing something over and over and over again. And they just kind of can't stop and get out of it. We call those motor loops. It's a difficulty in how the neurons are communicating with each other, right? But it's not damage to the brain. It's not a sign of low intelligence, and it's not a sign of muscle weakness. Those things could be going on with it, but that's not what a pure apraxia is. And we rarely see apraxia alone. So I want to talk a little bit about the incidence of apraxia. Roughly 6 to 10% of all children show some sign of apraxia. 2/3 of autistics have apraxia, right? That's a pretty huge number. Now, not all of them have it to a significant enough degree that will impair communication. But many speaking autistic people that I'm friends with and I talk to, they said that if I get sick or really tired and I'm physically dysregulated, or I get emotionally dysregulated, I'm really anxious or sad or really, really angry, I lose control of my motor, right? And then there's a portion of autistic people who are not able to produce speech spontaneously. So that's an interesting statistic for me. More interesting is that 15% of people with Down syndrome are thought to have movement difficulties, you know, specifically apraxia, but 98% with verbal apraxia. And when I first heard that, I was blown away. And I was like, what is that? You know, and I had to go and look for the article and the citation because that's huge, right? So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I think I tried to get cute and make those all come in, and they didn't. So talking about apraxia from a non-speaker's perspective. This is one of our clients, Ryan, who is autistic, and he says a body-brain disconnect, right? This disconnect between the brain and body communicating with each other is like trying to drive two people who can't get along, like siblings always bickering. And I had this great image of me and my brother in the back seat. And the frustration that must come with it. We have another guy, Gordy, who actually had an article a couple years back in the Washington Post because he was being offered the opportunity to either go to prom or to go to this presentation to local first responders, and he chose that. I think his parents were kind of really hoping he picked the prom. And he's working with Megan, who's one of our practitioners, and he said, I felt very strongly about writing to you today to give you some insight about the disconnected links that were supposed to make my body and brain work together in harmony. But they don't, and that's okay. You see, life for me and others like me is a daily game, except not fun, of tug of war. My brain, which is much like yours, knows what it wants and how to make that clear. My body, which is much like a 6-foot drunken toddler, resists. And I love that imagery because, you know, our clients who get communicative, they say, oh my God, I don't want to have my body doing these things. I'm kind of watching in horror, you know, as I'm pulling hair, as I'm leveling stuff off of tables, as these things are going on. That's not what I want to be doing. And so that can get frustrating. I asked Sid what his perspective on apraxia was. And he said, never having spoken, I'm unable to explain speech apraxia. But I am working on poetry compilation, so clearly speech is not necessary for survival. And I love that, comment from Sid and his perspective on apraxia. And I'm going to have Sid and Vice join me later in a little bit more discussion. I just kind of want to lay some groundwork here. So I'm kind of trying to zip through some of these fairly quickly. So we operate from a position of presuming competence, and that means that we believe that all people can and want to learn, right? And then it's up to us to do what we need to do to reveal abilities, to allow for practice, to teach age-appropriate content. And then I really like the term constructing competence, because that turns the process into an action rather than just a mindset. Like, oh, yeah, I presume competence. That's like a nice little thing to do. But do you construct it? Do you make that happen? That's a whole nother next level. We actually talk about this premise of the least dangerous assumption to say, okay, without, absolutely clear evidence, and if I may, I'll take Sid as an example. Here's Sid. He's diagnosed with Down syndrome. We all know, the typical doom and gloom diagnosis that's given out with that. And we've seen, test scores. And if I'm a teacher or a therapist, I can either say, well, I've read all these things and I know about this diagnosis. And by the way, you can fill in lots of other diagnoses with this. My expectations are pretty low, so, I'm not going to really worry about teaching him too much. But what if I'm wrong, right? What if he could be learning? And that's the mistake I make. Option 2 is I look at that and say, what if this is wrong and Sid actually can learn and I don't teach him, right? There, the error is I taught too much to someone. Well, if I have to make a mistake, I'm going to make option 2 every day, anytime, right? I would much rather have said, I taught too much than I didn't bother, right? And I think that's an important thing. So we operate from a presumption of presuming competence, that people can and want to learn. So that's what that really references when you hear that term. It does not mean, by the way, that we think that the kids already know everything, or adults for that matter. It just means that you want to learn, and it's up to us to help you access that information. I love this quote from Sid where he said, parents, have faith. You can teach your baby how irrational square roots form. Society only imposes harder irrational rules. So teach them all you can, right? And I love that idea of not being stuck in that convention of society's irrational norms. And I love Sid's play on words there, which is perfect. Sorry, I'm like toggling back and forth between screens. So Mike, I'm going to bring in Sid and Vaish here in a minute. Vaish has an amazing TED Talk, which I absolutely love, and it's one of my favorites. And I can put the link for it in the chat when I figure out how to work these windows a little bit better. I will put that into the chat. And she also has a podcast, and I'll put in, I have been a presenter on the podcast. There's been several other amazing people who have spent time talking and chatting with Vaish in this podcast, and I think you guys will all enjoy that. And so I'll share those links for you guys in the chat in just 1 minute. Okay. So let me stop there for a moment just to check in with you guys and to check in with Vaish and Sid. So let me stop sharing for a minute. And from what I can tell, there's not all that many folks. odd. So, so Vaish, do you guys want to pop on for a minute and
Yeah,
you
we're
know,
here. Fine.
tell us a little bit about your TED Talk, because you really speak really at the essence of presuming competence.
Yes. So Sid's just giving me a quick hug right now, but so so my talk is about going a little bit above presuming competence and actually actively assuming intelligence, because it's a little bit about my personal story with Sid. With our personal story, Sid has a diagnosis of Down syndrome and autism. Sid, he is non-speaking. He has reasonably significant visual issues and very significant fine motor issues. So none of the conventional methods that Elizabeth spoke about would have worked for Sid, not gestures. I mean, he was signing more and all done, but he lost that after a few years. And how much can you get with more and all done, right? So with pets, all he could get to was that I think he was stuck with, I want cookie and I want something else. I can't remember, music, I think it was. So it was by chance that I figured out when Sid was answering when we were asked to ask him a multiple choice question by school. We were just administrating a test because we were supposed to. I had no expectations from him. And he batted at the right answer. And that was all the motor control that he had at the time, was batting. He couldn't even point. But that was our window into how motor skills were so important and how we mistake motor skills for cognition. So as Elizabeth said, and that vision is motor, speech is motor. And I remember when we first met Elizabeth in 2008, that this thought was so striking to me that I hadn't thought about eye contact as being motor. And I definitely not thought about speech as being fine motor. And I think it might be the finest of motor activities that they do, but right. So, and when we started using a letterboard, we were, I remember Elizabeth saying that we're now moving into a gross motor movement from a fine motor movement. And I think, and it wasn't because of Sid's motor issues are more complicated than even typically children with Down syndrome. So it took us many years to get more and more comfortable, but to the point that he's now fluent and he is, like he said, he's writing poetry and so on. So the whole thing, so my TED Talk, if you just Google "Who Decides How Smart You Are," that's the title of my TEDx talk.
And I've added it into the chat.
Yeah,
it's in the chat.
And that's the whole thing, is that in our community, when we get a diagnosis of Down syndrome, we hear from teachers, we hear from doctors, we hear from educators. I think we hear from everybody about this label of intellectual delay being a given. And that was not the case for us, but we assumed that was the case. And in order for that not to be the case, you have to assume it not to be the case. So it's kind of a cycle, because if we don't provide the opportunities, then without the input, how are you going to get the output? So I make a case for input without getting very fixated on the output. And I think that has been very true in our lives, because there was a time when even pointing and batting, like I said, was very hard for Sid. And so at that point, I just focused on input, though eventually the output came. So he's still not able to sign. He doesn't speak, but he does point to his letterboard with increasing accuracy every year.
Right, because all of those motor things that we talked about require this praxis. And and especially in the Down syndrome population, to realize statistics like 98%, and let's say that's even huge, let's say it's 75%, but it's such a large percentage of apraxia, this breakdown between what your brain wants you to do and what your body can actually do. You're not going to get very far with just sign, with PECs, with pointing, even using AAC devices without a strong motor teaching for that. And so instead, all the cognition ends up being about is, or all the therapy and education and special education and everything else ends up really focused on cognition. So the analogy I use is, if I were going to take you guys out and teach you how to play baseball, right? And I say, here's the ball, here's the bat, hit the ball. And if you swing and you miss the ball, the therapeutic world would look at you and go, oh, you're not very smart. You didn't hit the ball. But if I had a bunch of just people I just grabbed off the street and they were in the other bleachers, they'd say, well, I don't know. I don't think that means they're not very smart. I think they just missed the ball. So instead, I'm gonna, coach your motor. So I'm gonna say, Vaish, hit the ball. And if she misses, I'm gonna figure out why did she miss the ball? Maybe it was the timing of her swing, and maybe Sid took his eyes off the ball, and maybe Stacy, her posture is off, and maybe Peter, his grip is not right on the ball, and maybe Catherine is swinging too early, right? And so each person, I'm going to coach why they missed the ball. But we don't coach motor in special education or in the therapeutic world. We coach cognition, which would be like missing the ball, and I come up to you and say, Vaish, ball, it's a ball. Hit it, right? And so she's kind of in her head going, oh no, it's a ball. I just missed it, right? And that's what's happened for most of the lives of, and for a long time I was that stupid person going ball, right? And I gave lots and lots of tests. I gave lots of tests when I worked at Children's. I gave lots of tests in my private practice, not even considering the fact that every single subtest of every single test that's out there requires a motor response. So if you fall in this group of people with motor sensory breakdown, with apraxia, you're not going to be able to take those tests. And you're going to score really, really badly, which is going to make everybody look at you and say, oh, you don't have any skills, right? So that's the crux of, we really love our tests. We really love demonstrate and show me that you're capable of learning for me to teach you. For me, and our perspective in Spelling to Communicate is, you prove to me you cannot learn. I will do every single thing. But instead of my students coming in and saying, you have to prove to me you can learn, you show me you're not capable of learning. Then maybe I'll give up on you, but not likely, because I'm very, very stubborn. So this kind of switches, things around. So we're coaching the motor. And when I started coaching the motor, it made a huge difference. So not only was Sid able then to use the gross motor of his arm to spell, so were thousands of students, autistic, Down syndrome, genetic conditions, other syndromes. We were seeing in student after student, client after client, huge successes when we took communication out of the fine motor of the mouth and the articulators and put it in the gross motor of the arm and coached that movement. And that's what, I'm going to go back to my slides for just a second. That's what Spelling to Communicate does. So in Spelling to Communicate, or what we call SUC, we teach purposeful motor. And we teach these skills taking communication out of the digits, out of the articulators, which are that hard to control 75%. We put it in the 25% of everything else. So posture matters, being able to use your arm to reach out and point to letters on a series of letter boards. We start with the most easy, where it's a field of 8 to 9 letters with the alphabet broken into thirds. Then we go to the whole alphabet. Then we go to, we get out of stencils that we use, which slows the motor down and gives a much more tactile medium. Then we go to a laminate board, which is smooth, which is what you see the guy in the picture using, and then we move to a keyboard. But ultimately what we're doing is we're teaching motor so that we're getting the synchrony between brain and body. And we have skilled and rigorously trained communication partners who teach this purposeful motor. And we have a whole hierarchy of going from, like I said, the simple motor to more complex, but at the same time, balancing that between more concrete responses where there's a known target so we can get that accuracy going, to the place where the person is accurate and we don't need to know where they're going because it's so accurate. Just like right now, My speech sounds are accurate, so anything I say, you can understand. If I put 2 bananas in my mouth, or even 1, my speech sounds wouldn't be accurate, and I could say the same thing and you wouldn't understand me, right? So it's all about motor accuracy. And that's what we do in S2C to teach that. And we're looking at, we've got 4 kinds of motor: reflexive and impulsive, that are fired. They're subcortical, they're protective movements. So we've got our fight or flight, we've got reflexive, like something gets thrown at my face, I close my eyes, right? And these actions are often what people refer to as behaviors. Down here, we've got purposeful motor. That's what we do. We focus on teaching the purposeful motor. We practice the daylights out of it until it becomes overlearned and automatic, right? What people call muscle memory. So, and that leads to this beautiful open communication. So my friend Sid, not only through communication has access to the things that he's interested in doing, agency, you know, he's making the decisions in his life, and autonomy, right? Where he is self-governing, and poetry. And back last year in January, before we knew everything was going to turn into craziness, Vaish and I sat down and she asked me to be a guest on her podcast. And I had asked Sid what his goal was for the year, and he said to write an epic poem. And really more than that, Sid has become an epic poet. And he wrote this poem, which I love, Hurricane. Quite far, farther than the love of my life, farther than people stand in quarantine, is a hurricane, my never-ending hurricane. My home is already there. So with communication comes the ability to really express yourself and to communicate what it is that you want to be able to communicate. So from there, I want to open it back up, and I'll let me give you my last couple slides so we can just switch over. In terms of communication, Sid said, I'm very grateful to have a means to express my thoughts. And I told you I had 2 organizations, and I'll put these into the chat. Growing Kids Therapy Center is my private practice, and I also started a nonprofit organization called IASC, the International Association for Spelling as Communication, with the mission of increasing communication globally through training, education, advocacy, and research. And you can find us at iask.org, and on our website we have a ton of videos and resources for parents, for practitioners, for non-speakers. And we use the term non-speakers to refer to people who have minimal speech, unreliable speech, but it falls into the branch of non-speaking because it refers to those who are not able to use speech as an effective means of communication. So it's a lot of information, you know, at once, but my real hope is that we move away from looking at what you can demonstrate, right? Because everything that you can demonstrate of what you know requires motor. If your fundamental largest issue is in controlling your motor, you're not going to be able to demonstrate that. And if we overlook that, we're missing voices like Sid's, and we're underestimating our kids. And there's lots of research that shows using motor-based tests is consistently putting kids in intellectual disability categories where they may not be there, right? So I want to open it up. Feel free to turn on your video if you want, so that I can see you guys, and
I can unmute
if you have a
everybody
question,
too.
you can. Yeah. So
Let me see. Participants. Right, I will unmute everybody.
If we unmute everybody at once, it might, if they can turn it on.
Actually, I'll mute people and they can unmute themselves if they have a
I think that
question.
will work.
Okay.
And I would love to have, an opportunity for Vaish and Sid to answer questions. I'm happy to answer questions. And you're a sweet girl. Yeah. Did you have a question? You seem to be.
Right. Everybody is able to unmute themselves if they have a question.
Yeah, I saw Marcella's video, but not her. It looks like she's.
She is on mute. I could unmute her. Yeah. Marcella, did you have a question? It seems like she's talking, but she's on mute. Let's see if anybody in the chat. Oh, Marcella asked at what age should kids get started in your program?
Okay, great. So Marcella, it looks like your little person is pretty little. So what I generally tell parents is I like people to give traditional early intervention a good fighting chance. And we will start consulting with parents at about 3.5. Usually at 3.5, I'll do consults and I'll give some ideas for language stimulation and some good literacy and ways to kind of interact with your kid and do a little bit of motor pointing and word play to kind of start off, and then we'll officially start doing sessions at 4.5. So we like to get things going. And now one thing is that a lot of people will say, well, my kid has this intellectual disability, they have Down syndrome, they've got this. And, the question is, well, how do you know what their intellectual capacity is? Because all tests that are testing your kids rely on motor. I have worked with several people with Down syndrome and seen amazing progress and actually picking up the letterboards really, really quickly. And so literacy and print is everywhere. You almost can't go into any room, and even half the places you are outside, without seeing print, right? Even on a hiking trail, you're going to see signs, you're going to see markers that have print, and print is very fixed. So we see that actually kids, even thought to be dyslexic, thought to be significantly intellectually impaired, actually have a strong grasp on literacy, spelling, and print. So yes, does apraxia affect the motor requirements for handwriting too? Yes, usually it does. And again, you can have varying degrees of apraxia, and apraxia is one of those things that's not always at a steady state. There are days that people are kind of more apraxic, if you will, kind of like stuttering, right? People who stutter have pockets of fluency, and then they'll have a time when their stuttering really increases. Same with apraxia. So apraxia is closely related to how regulated you are. So if you're very emotionally dysregulated, or you have state dysregulation because you're tired, hungry, sick, too hot, too cold, itchy. Those kinds of things can throw off your motor performance. Sherry, your son is 20. Yes, there is no, and I see Holly, our son is 32. There's no upward age. I've worked with people in their 50s with a variety of complex disorders who were able to spell and to be able to use this methodology. Holly, you said your son is 32 and apraxic. He's adept at the iPad. Can you help someone like him to use the iPad to communicate better? So I don't know if you're able to pop on. I'm not feeling like I'm super facile with this, but if you're able to pop on, I'm happy to talk to you more face-to-face about it. But because I have a few questions. So if you're not able to unmute and pop on, you can type it into the chat. And my question, I guess, would be, is when you say your son uses the iPad, so frequently I get people, in fact, just yesterday and today, I had somebody come in from out of town to see me at the clinic. And the mom says, well, my kid types on, on the iPad and on the phone and on a keyboard. And I said, that's great. Can he tell you about his day? And she said, and he's 25. And she said, well, no. And I said, can he, tell you about a movie that he's just seen? She said, no. And, so he types frequent things like go to Target, pizza for dinner, things like that. He has these things that he's practiced over and over. So remember when I showed you that motor wheel, and I know I only showed it to you for a hot second, that I talked about purposeful motor, that's doing something on demand. Once you practice the daylights out of something, it can become automatic. So for me, driving my car, because I'm no spring chicken, I've been driving my car for decades now, it's become automatic for me. And sometimes I realize, oh, there's my driveway, and I don't remember taking the turn to come into my neighborhood because it's become automatic. So for some of the things that kids have learned how to handwrite, learn how to say with their mouth, learned how to type, learned how to touch on the iPad, it's sort of automatic. And what we do is we would still kind of take a step back, get control of that motor, so that then we open it up to novel communication, right? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? Like Sid is with his poetry. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So what does your son do on the iPad? Like what kinds of things does he communicate?
Well, he mostly he goes to sites he loves, and he watches YouTube. So he he types in, and he reads very well, but he never has had spontaneous speech in the sense that, just like you said, he couldn't tell me about the movie he saw or tell me about his day. But I'll tell you what he does do. He'll try to say something to us, and we can't understand it. And so we say, write it down. And he's very good at writing. And so he'll take the pad and oftentimes he'll just write the word.
He sounds like to me that he is perfect for doing this, because it shows me he's got some decent motor control that he's writing. It shows me he's really keen on communicating. I think if we took it out of his fine motor and we really helped him learn that and coach that you'd start to find he's expressing really much more robust information. And the things he's typing, especially like, this is classically what I hear too, is like, oh, my kid goes on YouTube and he can type because he types in whatever the thing he's into on YouTube. But again, those often are a handful of things, or things that are related. So that becomes automatic, typing those words. But all the things that you're telling me are really good indicators that this could work really nicely for him.
Yeah, it was so frustrating all through school a long time ago. It was all about cognition, speech. And it just was so frustrating for us. So what you're saying really does make sense to me.
So I often find, particularly when I talk to communities where there's a diagnosis and a profile, like Down syndrome is really classic, right? Like, oh yeah, we all know about Down syndrome. You know, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's this. It's sort of like as if there's no room for variation. And that's why I really encourage you, listen to Vaish's TED Talk, because this is exactly what she talks about, that from birth, when the doctors were like, well, he's not going to do this, not going to do this. Like, really, how do you know? And so I find that when I talk to folks in a particular diagnosis population, that half of them, this has been sort of browbeat into, and it's hard to imagine there could be something else, a bigger communication, more novel thinking, creative thinking, higher intelligence than ever. And then I have the other 50% of the population, they're like, you know what? I haven't believed that stuff because, you know, sure enough, every time, you know, and they'll tell me stories of this is how your kid outsmarted you. And these are the clever things that they've done. And they've seen intelligence of, you know, and indicators of this, but can't get it out in the expressive speech. And for years, my whole career was working with people with complex communication disorders. And they had just outsmarted me so many times, and I knew there was more going in there, but I just couldn't get enough expressive output. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I think that that could be, you know, and the skills that he has sound like they would be good assets.
Yeah, I think he just gave up a long time ago. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I think he realized that he couldn't get it out, and he just gave up.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I would love for you to give it a try. We would be really happy to work with him. I see Sherry has written that her son uses Proloquo to go, but it's still not good on his iPad. What you're saying sounds common. Yeah. And again, we tend to see, Sherry, like a lot of people that, you know, kind of get those same icons as hamburger, french fries for like all food, or, you know, mom's car, always for goodbye. And again, that motor, that for those particular icons gets practiced. We don't get in ruts when the kids are spelling on the boards. By kids, I mean kids and adults, because every time they're spelling something different. And we've really raised this bar. And Vaish, I would love to hear you, you know, from your perspective, you know, share about that as well.
Do you mean about the repetitive communication? Is that the part?
You know, about beyond expectations, and, you know, I think, you know, we always say insides don't match the outsides, right? And seeing beyond what the expectations are, and even that motor component, like how did things change when you shifted from a cognitive perspective to a motor perspective?
Well, one of the things with Sid is that he presents as, from historically, we've been taught that somebody who looks like him, somebody who has a tongue protruding outward, somebody who has a face like him must be severely intellectually delayed. And that has been everybody's first reaction when they meet with him. And therefore, that is the first expectation we have to, you know, I had to break, where not I had to break, but I feel like all of us had to break, where we had to really, everybody I meet, I had to tell them that, you know, you may think this is what, he doesn't understand anything you say, but he has 100% receptiveness. I would start there. But what I say in my TEDx talk, and I'll say that here anyway, is that when Elizabeth talks about the outsides not matching the insides, it's like looking at a computer screen and looking at a broken display, and that could be the motor part, and that could be just how something looks, and deciding that a computer doesn't work. The actual cognition of the computer is the processor, and the actual cognition of a person is unknown to us. We have no means of accessing it. No test exists right now that can bypass motor and can actually tell you how intelligent a child is. So it is our utmost duty to presume competence or to presume intelligence, because we're doing a huge disservice to everybody. I don't think I've met a single child in my life that I can say with confidence doesn't understand, because how do I know? I don't know anything. So And when you don't know anything, how do we decide to presume that just because a child looks like this and historically has been treated as though they are, delayed intellectually? I mean, that's just an assumption. And it's kind of a self-fulfilling assumption, because then we never taught anything. And then because the child couldn't speak, we always thought that they couldn't understand because the child was repetitive, because the iPad program didn't allow them to progress. We thought all they understood was cookie and car. So we only taught them about more cookies and more cars. And so that just a cycle that never ends. So what I did when Sid, when I was teaching addition to Sid, I was just teaching. He wasn't giving me any output at the time when he was young, 5 or 6. I was just say 5 + 6 is 11 and stuff like that. And then he would, at some point, he got bored and looked away. And then somebody told me that when somebody's bored, move on to the next level. So instead of backing up, which most schools do, is that, oh, looks like you don't understand addition, let's go back to numbers. And that's where we lose the child, because the child has no way of showing you boredom except tuning out. We moved on to multiplication. And when he looked bored, we moved on to exponents and so on. And I think that is, along with figuring out output and processing are, I mean, just think of a computer analogy, right? They're very different things. And all we can see is output. And output depends on motor. And we need to get a out of the fact that motor is not processing.
Absolutely. And I love, and so Vaisha, I don't know if Sid, is feeling like he wants to, add in something on the spot or not.
He did spell out right now. Let me read out. He said, gains from letterboarding far outweigh the frustration from every other form of communication. Sid's been through a lot of frustrating forms of communication, as I'm sure as everybody else's kids. So he is encouraging people to try out letterboarding. But if anybody else has a question, I think he'll answer. He's up to answering. He's just slouching. You want to show your face, Sid?
Yeah. So if you have a question you want to address to Sid, that he can answer for you. But again, it's that deeper communication that's there. And I actually loved, so Vaish, it specializes in teaching science and chemistry and nutrition, and I love. Several years ago, she told me, she said, all right, Elizabeth, I'm going to be homeschooling now. And I told Sid, we're going to spend every day, we're going to do math. And then we're going to do science. And then we're going to do writing. And then we're going to do this. Is there anything I've left out? She's listed this whole set of things. Sid was just getting a little bit open, just a tiny bit on the board at the time. And he spells out F-U-N. And I never forget that story, because it also just shows me that deeper sense of humor. So when, Sherry and Holly, when you guys were asking about, is there more than what you're seeing on the iPad or using, Proloquo or things like that? There is this deeper sense of humor, the poetry. I mean, Sid's poetry, which I have become a real connoisseur of, and we have on the last Friday of the month, minus this Friday, this month, because it's the last Friday of the month is Christmas. But we have on final Fridays of the month through iAsk, the Neuro-Lyrical Cafe. And it's where non-speakers come together, and I'll put the link in a minute into the chat, to share poetry and song lyrics. And it's really amazing. And Sid's poems tend to be very concise, but very deep. He plays with words so beautifully, like he said about irrational for square roots, and society being irrational, and they're just so witty, and that's the communication that we get deeper into when we can access it through that gross motor of pointing. So if anybody wants to, ask a question for Sid or has another question, we're happy to answer that. I'm going to get you a link.
And I just want to add that the Neuro-Lyrical Cafe, many kids, writing excellent poetry. And I feel like the fact that they use the letterboards is a great leveler there, because when the communication is leveled up, then everybody feels. So at that point, diagnosis become important. So a child with Down syndrome or a child with different diagnosis, child with autism, they're all they're all writing excellent poetry, and you no longer see these things as, I mean, you may still have motor issues and you may have other things that come in the way and so on. But in terms of ability, you don't, I feel like when you it's a leveling field, don't you think, Elizabeth?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's a really special event. So it's free. I put it in the chat. I would love for you guys to join. And the thing is, you know, this kind of, I think for a lot of people, it sounds like kind of crazy, this idea of using the arm to reach out and point to letters in order to spell, to communicate. But we learn, and the vast majority of what we do day by day requires motor skills. So when I pick up my pencil to write with, that's a motor skill. When I eat my dinner using a fork, that's a motor skill. And if you don't think it is, look at a toddler and look at the toddler using a fork. You know, I've got 2 young nieces and nephews, and, you know, they're like putting the fork on their cheek, and they get everything on the fork and then they dump it out, you know. But then when you've been using it long enough, you've been doing it. Everything we learn starts with easier motor. We practice it and we go to a next complicated level. So even people who are learning to play piano, you start with scales. No one signs up their kid because they want them to play the scales. They want them to ultimately play a concerto or be able to play, you know, by ear. And that's where you, that's where we build from simple to complex. And it's the same thing in any sport, any motor skill you've already learned. So we're really kind of following that same trajectory. Catherine said, do you know how, do you have to know how to spell or read in order to begin letterboarding? My son, 7, is in 1st grade general ed. He has tons of sight words and emerging reader. So I'm going to suggest that he probably knows even way more and has got stronger skills to read and spell than you even think that he does. Because again, you're having to look at probably very fine motor output. Like, how do you know what someone's reading unless they speak it or unless they write it or show some sort of comprehension thing, like saying they read the strip that says point to the dog and they point to the dog. So bottom line, 7 is not too young. And even if somebody is struggling with that early literacy, we're able to help with that. But I would say that's a great time to start. And the fact that he's been included in a gen ed is fantastic. So Catherine, I would give it a whirl. I know there's some people on who are from our non-speaking community. I see a couple of folks in the chat, so feel free to throw in your own 2 cents in there. And for some of the rest of you guys, are you all local to Northern Virginia, or are we getting lots of other folks from further away? Because we can also try to connect you with resources that are further. Okay, great. So you guys are local. Excellent. Alexandria. Okay. Fredericksburg. And Kimberly hikes in from Fredericksburg to come see us at Growing Kids. Okay, Lindsay's in Fredericksburg. Lindsay is a former graduate student of mine, which always makes me very happy to have it on board, because I always say that, you know, I feel that not only did I practice making assumptions that were wrong with my clients, I taught things that were wrong to graduate students. So Lindsay, I would love to get you working with non-speakers in the Fredericksburg area. Okay. I'm going to type into the chat again my email. If you are interested in talking to us at Growing Kids, you can contact me for an even better response. Contact Julie, who is our practice manager at Growing Kids, Julie at growingkidstherapy.com. You can address questions to me. Julie is just much more efficient at answering than I can be, because I get backlogs sometimes, and we're happy to help. Sherry in Central PA, we might be able to, well, one, we could get you started close by, and we can do some virtual coaching. And I do have some practitioners in PA, but they're in the Philly area. Oh, actually, and I lie, I've got someone in the Pittsburgh area too. You'll see my geography is lacking. Okay, Vaish, what did Sid have to add in there?
Oh, he just said, have a good night to everybody. He's gone to stretch out a little bit.
Oh, nice, nice. So again, we're happy to answer questions. I really appreciate you all being here. And what I would say is think about that concept that I talked about, the least dangerous assumption, right? You know, we can base, you know, all the tests, all the things we've been told, but what if those are wrong, right? What if those are wrong and we didn't try? Upping the bar, upping the expectation, and seeing what's there. And I really understand that hope is the most valuable commodity of all. And that's a hard one to invest. But we do see progress. You know, I can't predict what's going to be the end mark for students, but I do know where we have never had anyone who hasn't made progress, and most of them make significant progress doing this. So I would be happy to talk to you further. Catherine says thank you to me and to Sid and Vaish. I'm glad you found this was lots of useful information. Thank you. Oh, Kimberly asks, when is the next parent training at our practice? So we do offer a parent cohort that we work with parents not only on the boards, but also all the motor coaching off the boards, right? So to do either give me as basic as activities of daily living, but also to things you want to take on, a hobby or a sport or learn a skill or be able to make your own breakfast or things like that. So we also do this motor coaching off the boards too. So we have a parent cohort that meets twice a month for 5 months. So there's 10 sessions. And we usually offer a morning class and an evening class. And that will kick off in the beginning of March. And if you email me or Julie, particularly Julie, she can help you with information about that.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So I just want to clarify, my son Alex is 20 years old, and as you say, non-speaking. He is still in school. With COVID, it's been pretty hard. He, as far as we know, he doesn't read. He cannot write. But he really seems to understand and comprehend everything going on around him. So you're saying this would be worth, like, this is something we should maybe look into.
I would love for you to try it out. I know it feels like a big gamble and a risk, but we have, at Growing Kids, we have out of town sessions. So they're specifically set up for folks like you. In fact, I just saw someone who is in the York-ish area who just came down yesterday and today. So our out of town sessions are Mondays and Tuesdays, and you come into town on Sunday evening. Julie can connect you with some nearby hotels. And then we do a session in the morning, a session in the afternoon on both Monday and Tuesday. I kind of send you home with, okay, the final session, I coach the parent or me or one of my colleagues, and then say, okay, this is what we want you to work on. We can do a little virtual support between visits, but we kind of give you the basics to get going. And at least in those 4 sessions, it will be enough to let you see what's going on. So okay. At 20, I would strongly bet that your son is able to spell. And a lot of parents, I mean, not just parents with Down syndrome, but even my parents of, autistic kids are like, oh, I'm doing this because my friend so-and-so has been bugging the heck out of me for years about this. And they're like, but, I don't think he knows even his alphabet, much less how to spell. And then the kid's like, and nailing those letters. And you're not going to see, perfection at first, but it should be enough to see, oh yeah, this is something that could work. So in that case, it's a 2-day, experiment.
Okay. It just seems like everything we tried, like even when he was younger and we did the signing, it wasn't very long that he would try to use the same sign for everything.
Right.
And you were saying about with the AC devices, like he'll, mom's car, mom's car, mom's car, like things that are familiar. And he does have some speech with things that he's familiar with, but
Right.
Okay, well, we will get in touch then.
Yeah, and so the thing with sign is bilateral, number one. The hand shapes, I mean, even, most people are like, I'll take this as a more, this is a more,
Yeah.
But, it gets hard to make some of the hand shapes and it's bilateral. We've got one movement, which is the arm going back and forth. We even use a pencil to be kind of like a fake finger, to hit the board. And so the motor action is actually much simpler, but we're never spelling the same thing. So the action that's the same that gets practiced is this movement of the arm, and it's kind of, in some ways, target practice, right? Are you hitting the letter you intended to hit? And if you hit the neighbor letter, that's not bad, right? Like, think about darts. If you're aiming for the bullseye, if you hit the other ring, pretty good. I mean, I'm pretty happy if I actually hit the dartboard, right, and not someone else. So it starts. You'll get a good sense of his skills, and we will get a good sense of what are the relative strengths and weaknesses, and
Okay.
and we work on that and go from
Thank
there.
you.
You're very welcome. I look forward to meeting you guys. Okay, anybody else? I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. Stacy, you see anything that I'm missing?
Let me double check. Let me double check. Okay. Let's see. No, I think they already asked when the next parent training is.
And that starts in early March after the
Yeah.
holidays.
But what I'd like to do is send a follow-up email to everybody with all the information, everyone who registered. So I will do that. I just want to make sure that I have all the great information that you provided.
Yeah, I put a bunch of resources on the link to Vaish's TED Talk in there, to the link to the podcast. I put a link to Neurolyrical, our emails. The iAsk website, I think, is on there. I'll put it in just in case. There's lots of good information on there. I'll put the Growing Kids website.
Okay. Yeah, because I actually, and I shared with everyone when they signed up the TED Talk, but I'll share it again. I shared it with everybody, the link, but I will definitely share it again. So.
Perfect. And I'm gonna probably do a horrible job on this name. Omema. I think, just in case, I think at one point you had a question, I want to make sure I didn't miss that.
Yes, hi.
Hi. How old is your
My question was about my son who is 16, almost going to 17, that he is verbal, but he's not conversational. How will the program will help? I mean, he gets speech. It's just sometimes comprehending, trying to express himself, he gets a little bit confused. Beside when especially want to say stuff, but he's a good speller. So if I was like, I couldn't understand what he's saying, he usually gets his whiteboard and write it down or
Oh,
actually
perfect.
spell it out for me. But
Yeah.
I want to see how much more I can help him if it was.
I think I would suspect, again, when I see someone who's got, so when we've folks who've got a lot of speech, I've got some guys who never stop talking, right? But they're what we call unreliable, because sometimes they say what they mean. Sometimes they're just scripting. Sometimes they're saying the polar opposite of what they mean. And so we refer to that as unreliable speech. And we have people who do really well with that too. So I think, especially if you're local, to come in and give it a try to see what we can do to sort of expand on that, get into deeper, communication, and again, this is not an overnight miracle by any chance, by any means. It's motor and it's practice. But I think it could be a really good tool. And 16, 17 is a great age. Generally, I love my littles too, but they're totally squirrely. And when Sid and I started, I think just he was a moving target. And now some of my older guys are wanderers and movers too, and we work with that as well. But yeah, I think definitely, even though he's got a lot of speech, give this a try. But what that tends to indicate to me is that he's got, a little bit more motor control. So that's a good, that's kind of sometimes a good asset.
When you say local, I mean you're in the area that we just like walk in just to, or make an appointment, or just
Yeah, definitely making an appointment. No, meaning like if you're not having to, come drive from further or far away. But yeah, definitely I would contact Julie to schedule an appointment.
Okay.
And we'd love to see you.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And Dana and Ethan, who joined us from Portland, thank you for joining. And Vaish and Sid, I don't know if you want to pop on for a second. Thank you so much for joining. I mean, I can talk all day long about the success we see with non-speaking people, with people with Down syndrome especially, who really have just defied all the conventional expectations. But to hear it from Vaish and Sid is so important. So thank you for joining us, Vaish.
Yeah,
And
thank
Sid.
you, Elizabeth. I think I just want to repeat what Sid said. When he spelt it, I thought he was just saying it, but now it feels more important. Is that the gains that you receive from letterboarding, even if they're slow, they far outweigh the frustrations that you have, of trying a new technique, even though you've tried maybe many things to communicate. So Sid and I would highly recommend it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and for you and Sid joining us tonight. Okay, so thank you all so much for having me. It was my pleasure and a real honor to be able to spend some time with you. Sorry, I was a little klutzy with the tools on this. I've gotten like super Zoom proficient. I'm like, oh, this is a little different. So
no, everything was great. And I think a lot of people are very appreciative.
Well, it's my pleasure. And thank you for having me. And I, again, I'm happy to do whatever I can to support your organization and any of your members. And we're just happy to talk to any of them, anyone who wants to contact us.
And I'll make sure to send a follow-up email with both the recording and all the great information that you shared.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Great.
All right, you guys have a
you.
great done.
Thank you.
Okay, just firing off a little message there. All right, thank you again.